All right, welcome back to SOS. I'm Stas RMBA, and today I want to talk about Huckleberry Finn and SHTF related. So, I don't know how many of you have ever read the story by Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but I thought this would be a great scenario to play out in an SHTF role. Now, if you're familiar with the book, the story, right? If you're familiar with this story, you know, Huck is, his dad is the town drunk, and he does everything he can. He's lived his life homeless and ragged clothes, and spends most of his time fishing and messing around in the woods and trying to stay away from home. He does everything possible to stay away from his father, which basically robs Huck. Anytime Huck has money, he basically tells, because other folks are trying to make Huck civilized and trying to educate him and teach him how to read and write and all this stuff. Well, his father doesn't want that of him. He wants money, and he basically, he'd beat Huck. He'd beat the crap out of him and take what he could from Huck as much as possible. And he had Huckleberry Finn. He had his friend Tom Sawyer, and they used to, Tom Sawyer in an SHTF scenario, the wild imagination from another young man, leads to a lot of other unusual adventures along in the story. And they even trade places at sometimes. It is like, well, I'm Tom, and then he's Huck or whatever. They even trade places along inside the story, and you get to thinking about how things play out, and how Huck wanted to run away and does so, and has to. I mean, either that, or, I mean, if he stayed, he would have been probably beaten to death at some point. If you've ever kept, if you kept up with the story there. But at some point, he probably would have been beat to death if he didn't spend as much time as he could, away from that environment. And leaving led to all these crazy adventures. He even ran into a runaway slave, which didn't know at the time. There's more to the story in that, but it gets me thinking. If you just go into that story, okay, he ends up with a lot of different families. He runs into Conmen. At some point, on the raft, they him and his newfound friend, they commandeer different vessels along the way, and at some point they get ran over, traveling down the Mississippi River. There's so much going on in the story, right? The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. If you incorporated that into that, I had so many things on my mind today, and one of them was being alone during SHTF, being by yourself during SHTF, and I got to thinking Huckleberry Finn. I don't know why, because I got to thinking, from all the books that I've read, all the stories that I've read. I mean, this goes into so many different SHTF science fiction novels and science fiction, fictional novels, as you were, and in all these different fictional novels that I read, it goes into slavery and all sorts of stuff. I mean, humans being forced into slavery, and then towns being separated by martial law, and it's serious. Fenced in communities shut off. I mean, you get to thinking about TV series where you've got Jericho, right? Jericho's another one, right? And you get to thinking about all these different situations, and the townspeople, they form a militia, and you've got different types of martial law and people getting hung for stealing stuff, and people getting shot and killed for an argument, and all these different types of things that would play out in a post-apocalyptic world, right? And if what if if you applied just a little bit of thought with the Huckleberry Finn adventures, and think of a young man getting beaten, and it's uh, police ain't coming, 911. There's no there's child services, or there no one's coming to the home to rescue anyone. And there could be a lot of abuse take place during SHTF. You get to thinking about people who live in the sticks, the backwoods, all over the place, and there could be a whole lot of abuse going on there. And like I was saying, it. I get to thinking another thing. Here's another one I'm thinking is the big wigs, right? These these very wealthy people that that can stockpile gold, stockpile silver, and all these different things, and can afford to buy the bunker, and they have the bunkers and things like that, and they rise during SHTF. I mean, they become kings and queens, right? They rise above everyone else, and people become slaves to these people. I'm just throwing out another idea here. It's post-apocalyptic world, and they just so happen they've survived. They create a type of private security that's basically they form their own group of mercenaries or whatever, and can force people to work for them. You run, you die, kind of thing. I mean, this goes into a lot of different series and books and things that I've read along the way as well. And something like that could happen. And what if you had to escape and run away and get away from something like that, and travel the river and end up in a bunch of wild adventures? I'm not saying that all of us would be Huckleberry Finn, but what if they're it's something that could possibly happen. And for a young man like Huckleberry Finn, for example, being raised in that environment, that's kind of how I grew up, being in the woods all the time and going on imaginary adventures. Yeah, right. BA on imaginary adventures. I'm not the only one. There's tons of people out there that have their own imaginary adventures out there, and but running into Tom Sawyer and pretending, they what do they pretend to be, bank robbers or something crazy? I can't remember, but they end up together. I mean, in today's time, if it was to happen in nowadays, they would pretend to be what, gangsters or something, right? Something along those lines. And uh, I know, it sounds silly, but the thought, is there, and the adventures would be there for for someone out there that had to get away from some sort of environment like that. So it would play out in that kind of scenario. But you the Feuds, because he runs into a family that adopts him. He ends up running away from them too, but there was a family that adopted him that they were in a feud with another family. So there were many shootouts between the two families, and that would be something else that would happen in a world without rule of law. Because if you switch to world without rule of law, like I said, no one's coming, you know. So feuds would be dealt with by yourself, right? So, you know, if someone's just over the hill and you guys get in an argument over cattle, property line, whatever, I don't know, you know, whose land is what, and you planted that here and that belongs to me, and, you know, they go to try and take your crops or whatever, you know, it could be all sorts of different things that people would get into scuffles about. But it's definitely something to consider. I know it doesn't make much sense, but I figured I would relate. Huckleberry fan. Why not? So for those of you out there that are familiar with that, then if you have any other suggestions or thoughts into this, let me know. And leave your comment below. I'd be really happy to see how many folks are familiar with that story. But the conmen, the swindlers, you know, people that, because that would go on as well. I mean, the two traveling men that pretend to be people that they're not, and they go and put on stage plays and swindle people out of money. They put on a show. They pretend to be some fancy artist from up north or wherever, you know, or from another country, and putting on a show and swindling people. Eventually they end up tarred and feathered at some point. I think that's in the book as well. They end up tarred and feathered. There's going to be tarring and feathering as well. So that's another interesting thing that would probably happen. But I figured I would share this. It's just my crazy, wild thoughts. Huckleberry fan, why not? And crazy Tom Sawyer and his wild imagination. I figured I'd share. Alright, that's all I got. You're watching SOS. I'm Stats RVA. Have a beautiful, fabulous, fantastic day. Rainbows and unicorns. God bless. Take care.